the Washington Square News and is part of the NYU Student Government Assembly. This year, Arna is a NYU Gallatin Global Human Rights Fellow and will be working with women's refugee rights in Belgium over the summer. Next, we have Ayla Mansman, she/her, is a freshman at Manhattanville College in New York. She is a lifelong activist, always working to create and utilize art to awaken activism among young people. She served as Safe Bay's youth organizing director for 2 years, overseeing all of their youth ambassadors and contributing to many of their prevention video content creations, and has now transitioned onto their board of directors. Prior to that, she developed and produced Safe Bay's first consent summit for over 750 students throughout the greater New England in attendance. She has served as the state director for March for Our Lives and an e-tag advisory member at Break the Cycle. In 2019, she moderated a local town hall for presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg in Portland, Maine. She has presented on behalf of Safe Bay at the Every Voice Coalition Summit at Harvard, the American Federation of Teachers Conference, the New England Youth Identity Summit, among others. She has received scholarship awards from March for Our Lives, the Community Strings Project, US Cellular's 16 Under 16 contest, and more. Ayla is known for her sexual assault survivor advocacy in her high school, resulting in her suspension, which she challenged in court with help from the ACLU in 2019, where she won the case and all subsequent appeals in 2020. The verdict of the case resulted in a precedent which affirmed students' First Amendment rights within school walls. Next, we have Emily Ratkalviak. She is a senior at Auburn University, majoring in microbiology with minors in public health, business, and counseling. And she is the South Regional Co-Chair of the NRAPE on Campus Student Survivor Caucus. Emily has extensive experience in reproductive rights and justice advocacy and anti-sexual violence advocacy. Also serving as a sexuality and reproductive health educator, Emily gives presentations and dedicates her time to organizations on her campus, as well as in the greater Alabama, Georgia area, discussing these topics along with their intersections. Her personal experiences with endometriosis, reproductive care, and sexual assault inspire her to raise awareness and enact change, as well as to support others in their experiences. Jessica J. Mencia, she/her Aya, is a PhD student at the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. She graduated with her BA in Public Policy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her MSW from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. Jessica serves as a student assistant and educator at the University of Buffalo Sexual Violence Prevention Unit. In addition to her research, she serves as an advocate for the New York Birth Control Access Project and a case manager volunteer for the New York Abortion Access Fund. She has also served as a board member and volunteer for the Carolina Abortion Fund that serves North and South Carolina. And finally, our moderator today, Leah's relationship with VALOR began as a Women of Color Caucus member in the early 1990s while working at a local member rape crisis center program. A longtime supporter of the coalition, Leah would eventually serve as a board member and consultant before joining the staff as a program manager in 2016. She is an educator, facilitator, and trainer on the multidisciplinary issues of interpersonal violence for diverse populations. Media and policy advocacy are among Leah's additional skills, having consulted on numerous media projects, videos, and campaigns. She co-authored Women of Color Leadership, a look at the experiences of women of color executives in the anti-violence against women's movement for the Women of Color Network, funded by the Miss Foundation in 2013, and was the consultant and co-author of VALOR report, Reciprocal Advancement, Building Linkages Between Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Leah is an assistant professor of film studies at Chapman University and holds a PhD in cinema media from the University of Southern California. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good early evening to you wherever you are on this spinning rock in space. So happy that everyone is here with us today to participate in this very important conversation, which I believe we are hoping will be an ongoing conversation, not a one-time event. Um, it's really important that we talk to each other, learn each other's languages, the way in which we understand these different issues and come to collective decisions about collective outcomes that benefit us all, right? So why are we here today? Okay, so I am charged with kind of like establishing a framework for our conversation, and I just want to let everybody know that right up front, I'm asking for everyone's grace in the event that I misspeak or say something that is incorrect. Use that as an opportunity to educate me, drop something in the chat, expand my understanding about things, because we are all continually learning and growing. And, you know, there's no way any of us can know everything. So let's afford everyone grace here for this conversation. This is part of our coming together as diverse movements and interested parties in seeing this be a fabulous world, right? And so we want to give each other the space to learn and grow and make mistakes and embrace change and embrace new information and new knowledge. So that's, you know, that's my own self-interest, but that's for all of us to continue to work together across movements and across issues. Having said that, I'll just go ahead and put the cards on the table here. The anti-sexual violence. Let me step back for just a moment. Emily, you made a very good point earlier about making sure that we be clear that we may say some things or talk about some things that are upsetting or triggering or just kind of, disturbing for some people. And so I just wanted to put that little disclaimer out there that in the event that there's something that is uncomfortable, that we're just going to say that up front, and that we'll take care of you. You'll be all right because we'll take care of you. You are in good hands in this space. Emily, is there anything that you would want to add to that?
Just a reminder that after this panel, you may have some complex feelings come up and it might be emotionally heavy. So definitely prioritize your self-care today and tonight. Maybe find a way to be extra kind to yourself.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. Appreciate that. So we're just gonna put our cards on the table here. That the anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic violence movements have not historically been in ongoing active alliance with the pro-choice fight folks who've been working diligently for over much longer, but we can mark it at the 50-year mark, much less that of the reproductive justice field, right? We have not been at the forefront of a lot of those conversations, and we as a field and as a movement, we're really okay with allowing those activists and advocates handle that part of a larger understanding of patriarchal violence and oppression, right? We know that there are ideological and economic and political reasons for this, but current social forces are compelling us to bring the anti-violence folks into this conversation. Bring, shove, drag, whatever, however we get there, we understand how important it is that we acknowledge all of the heavy lifting that the pro-choice folks have done and the reproductive justice folks have done. We acknowledge that, and we appreciate that leadership, and we want to have that movement's back. Beyond that, we want to be active partners and active co-conspirators in that fight. We have known anecdotally in sexual assault and domestic violence, the relationship between that interpersonal violence and that may result in an unintended or an unwanted pregnancy. And as a movement in the field for 50 years, we've always been able to say, as advocates to survivors, that you have options and you have choices. right? That has always been part of our a method of working through empowerment and choices and options with survivors. And that is jeopardized. We can no longer confidently say that across the United States, right? So we also have data that we know anecdotally that a pregnancy can result in that. And we also have data that demonstrates it. 2016, 2017 study from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey highlights that nearly 15% of survivors became pregnant as a result of a sexual assault. And we know that in the 2020 Turnerway study, they found that individuals who were denied abortions were more likely to stay in those abusive relationships than be able to get themselves out of it, right? So we know both anecdotally and empirically that interpersonal violence and a pregnancy can keep people in abusive situations, which can lead to a whole host of other social ills, whether homelessness, economic deprivation, and so on, right? There are all these other factors that can proliferate as a result of that nexus of violence and pregnancy, right? The anti-sexual violence and intimate partner violence activists, advocates, and allies, or wherever your activist home base may be, whether you're doing in poverty justice, disability, or queer or prison abolition, or environmental justice, and other fights, we know that the reproductive justice fight is for all of us, that there is something that we all should be doing to ensure reproductive justice, as articulated by Loretta J. Ross and Ricky Solinger, and looking towards Sister Song. They define reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent those children in safety with dignity. So we see how the reproductive justice fight is bigger than, choice in this moment. And however, right now, choice is an entree point for us to look at securing the larger reproductive justice scene, right? So when we're talking about preventing and ending sexual violence, we can't do that without working at the intersections of violence and oppression, right? And recent rollbacks in reproductive rights are about more than just restricting access. We know that it's part of a larger strategy to continue to harm women, the LGBTQ community, persons who are immigrants, persons who are in detention or incarceration. We know that it is part of a larger strategy to concentrate power into the hands of few by disenfranchising, marginalizing, and oppressing the masses, right? This is not a conspiracy. It's part of a larger strategy to continue to harm us and take away rights associated with personhood and bodily autonomy. So today, we're centering young adults as part of this conversation. Young adults across the country are currently living in the most restrictive time for reproductive care. Now is the time for us to listen and learn and work in allyship and co-conspiratorship and, do what we got to do, take it to the streets. And because this is about all of our futures and most urgently, those of you who will be voting in 2024 for the first time. So I just want to put that out there. I have some questions. I want to go ahead and start with the questions and ask the panelists these questions and the response. And then as we discuss, if you have questions, go ahead and post those. Grace, I hope I'm saying the right thing. Go ahead and post those in the chat, and then we'll try and integrate those into the broader panel conversation. So, based on what we know and understand what's been going on, recent things happening in the news, with signing legislation and 6 weeks and all that other kind of stuff, how are the reproductive rights and anti-sexual violence movements beyond those statistics? How are those movements connected? What are our commonalities? What's the common language that we should be using to build a common foundation towards a collective end? And I'd like Arna or Emily to take that on.
Yeah, so we're obviously here today because these issues are so intricately connected to one another. At the core, these issues are both about the empowerment of individuals as well as the right to control our own bodies. When we look at the reproductive rights movement framework. It really aims to center full bodily autonomy, and it also really works to achieve and prioritize, as well as protect, the well-being of individuals, that being mentally, physically, economically, spiritually, politically, socially, and environmentally. And so when we look into reproductive oppression, the lack of control of individuals and the controlling and exploiting of those individuals, namely women, through their bodies, their sexuality, labor, and reproduction. And when we look at that, along with the lack of access that we see with reproductive care, there's a significant restriction and harm created because of those on the anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic violence movements. And so, how is that? Why is that? Well, I think first and foremost, we can't separate these discussions about reproductive oppression from other oppressions, and in this case, sexual and domestic violence. Doing so, I think, is comparable to separating an individual's reproductive health from the mental and physical, social, those different well-being elements of themselves. It's removing the factors that compound each other and the issues of reproductive oppression and sexual violence. And so, with that in mind, and with the interconnectedness of these two movements, our prevention strategies and our methods of approach have to be informed and rooted in an understanding of the larger systemic oppressions that are at play, as well as the intersections that exist. I'm representing EROC today, as it was mentioned, and they have a wonderful framework called Centering the Margins. And I think it's a beautiful and wonderful example of how we can not only focus on, but center historically underserved and marginalized individuals, specific to EROC that applies to student survivors, while also focusing on attending to their specific needs. So,
that's great. If you have a link to that tool, that would be great. And if you would be willing to share that link, that would be awesome. And EROC is Ending Rape on Campus. Great. Arna.
Yeah, I mean, Emily brought up some great points. And I think for me, I see the anti-sexual violence advocacy movement as part of the reproductive justice movement. The reproductive justice framework is so intersectional and so based on addressing systemic oppressions, including stuff like environmental justice and racial justice. And for me, I think when we're talking about building foundations based on language and terminology, some of that comes up for me is also like access. Reproductive justice is not only about choice and the right to choice, but also about access. There is no choice without equitable access, and that access to whether that be consent education, comprehensive sex education, birth control, and a whole range of reproductive health care is so connected to the anti-sexual violence advocacy movement. When we talk about anti-sexual violence advocacy today, some of the primary strategies that come up are things like primary prevention. And primary prevention is so connected to consent education and comprehensive sex education that includes queer representation, that includes racial representation, and that's a huge part of the reproductive justice movement as well. So even beyond the right to abortion, and the right to alternative pregnancy options, I see the anti-sexual violence advocacy and reproductive justice movements connected through those principles of access, equity, and choice in all realms of healthcare and bodily autonomy.
Nice. Thank you for that. Oh, this is so exciting, and I'm hoping people who are on the call I hope sparks are going off, and you're seeing ways in which we can connect and kind of, even ramp up even more connections and relationships between the works that we do at the local level, right? Jessica, for some people, this may be the first conversation that they're listening to, that they're part of, that is looking at these connections and the relationship between the various work that we do. And how did you get involved in doing all of this? And, who or what paved the way for you to get involved in doing this work?
Well, I mean, of course, like a lot of the historical figures in reproductive justice, like Loretta Ross and folks at Sister Song, that was like, I want to honor them and give them space as well, because they really shaped and paved the way for me just with their efforts and their work. Especially, I go to school in Buffalo, but I'm actually from North Carolina, especially for folks in the South. But my personal story is that when I was a sophomore at UNC, I applied to be on the board of directors at the Carolina Abortion Fund. And that is really how I got involved with a lot of reproductive justice work, but specifically pro-abortion and abortion access work. So I did that, and I helped manage the helpline. So people will call the helpline to ask for funding. And then I moved to Buffalo, and I did some work with the New York Abortion Access Fund there as well. I'm still a little new with them just because it's interesting working in one state that has certain abortion laws and then switching to another state that has ones that are quite different. But I do work with both of them still, and it's been nice to see how the funds grow. I don't think a lot of people know kind of like the backwork of abortion funding, but it is like its own community, and you really get to see a lot of the on the ground efforts. Like we all know what goes into like the policy work and like some of the like more visible movements, but when it comes to abortion access and abortion funding, it really is like its own community and its own space. So that's how I got started, and I learned so much just from being involved and on the ground with those organizations.
Emily, if you want to tell us how you got involved, and for either of you, and then I have one more question after this, and just being conscious of time. How important was it that the places where you got started were receptive to your youth organizing presence?
Yeah. So I started small, with cultural-based changes, like leaving my locker open in middle school unlocked with boxes of tampons and pads for anyone that needed them, and starting conversations not just with my friends who were females, but all the individuals in my school about the struggles of menstruation that I specifically had as someone with endometriosis. But currently, what was so important and what's so helpful, especially because in Alabama, it can be kind of lonely and easy to not be able to see how many people are actually doing this work here, is that for me, I set meetings up with people all across my university. So campus security director, the COSAM, dean of students. I met with so many different individuals in student affairs, health promotion and wellness, through the psychological services too, just to kind of touch base with them about their experiences in life, and to talk through like, these are the struggles I'm seeing on our campus. These are solutions that I think could work. These are ideas I have. What is your advice? How can you help me? You know how to navigate these channels more than I do. What does that look like for me? Can you kind of provide me that reality check? And so that has been incredibly instrumental, as well as all the resources that End Rape on Campus has provided me through the Student Survivor Caucus. That has given me a lot of great opportunities. And then I'd say the last component that's been really, really helpful is just also confiding in people in my community, because of the support that I end up seeing. There's a lot of older communities in my area that are more conservative and religious. And so in some smaller spaces with those communities, I've had some wonderful discussions about what they can be doing to help forward this movement as well, with their positions in power in our community.
Nice. Ayla, I didn't want to leave you out of that conversation. And when I think about young adult youth activism, you work with a young population. I mean, we're all young at heart and young at spirit, but you work with like high schoolers and middle schoolers, and talk a little bit about how important activism is with the populations that you work with and how you got involved.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, right now across the board, activism seems to be pretty popular. Young people everywhere. I mean, we're all trying to connect with one another over some mutual community base. And I think activism is home for a lot of people. And it definitely was for me. In my house growing up, activism really was similar to a religion in my family house. And I really grew up in this space and feel really fortunate to be able to work with young people across the country, helping them foster these skills on how to be a successful activist in a safe and effective way. And then the work that I do, that activism is through the lens or specific to sexual violence prevention. But it has been so great to be able to build that community up and foster the next generation of powerful, powerful voices.
Nice. We understand how sexual and dating domestic violence prevention becomes a prophylactic to unwanted pregnancies, right? And so it's all connected. Arna, did you want to add to that point about how you got involved and what's important about appealing to youth or young activists?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, a huge part of my involvement in the anti-sexual violence advocacy movement and the reproductive justice movement was my journey as a sex educator. I was a part of the Planned Parenthood Teen Council in Portland, Oregon. And so we taught a lot of sex education and consent education through that program, which kind of solidified my beliefs in reproductive justice, primary prevention, advocacy, etc. And I think, you know, it's so important for young people to be centered in this movement, not only because they've been working so hard, but because these issues affect them the most. When we talk about like consent education and sex education and access to those resources, it's young people who are facing the most barriers to access and who need that access the most. And when we talk about abortion access, it's young people ages 18 to 24 who are trying to access most of this like abortion care and reproductive health care. And once again, it is young people and those like age groups that are facing the most sexual violence or sexual oppression. So young people are not only at the forefront of this fight, but they're also being disproportionately affected by these issues. And so it's super important that we highlight and empower the voices of young people, fund initiatives of young people, and just overall kind of recognize the hard work that is being put in, even historically, by the youth at the frontiers of these movements.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. I'm like, I wasn't that as smart as you all when I was young, but you know, question with today, but that's another conversation. I do want to ask, some would say there are a lot of sexual assault DV organizations on our call today, which I'm ecstatic about. I am over the moon about, and across the country. And many of them have youth programs, violence prevention programs, sexual assault, dating violence prevention programs, and have been doing this work for really, you know, have working around sexual assault and have had the fight of struggling to get into a school or some kind of a youth facility, or struggling against parents who think that, you know, their middle school and high school children are too young to talk to them about sexual violence and dating violence and so on. And so I'm imagining they're going to also hear that this same population is too young to hear about reproductive justice. And what is it that you would want all of the, I'm going to say older folks, anybody over 25 at this point, but what would you want people who are running these organizations and these programs to know about working with a youth population around reproductive justice? What kind of strategy should they look at? Or, you know, if they're already talking about consent around sexual and dating violence, you know, how do they expand that to include reproductive justice and reproductive health? What is it that we need to know?
I'll keep it short and sweet, but I think 2 big pointers is meet me where I'm at, you know, meet us where we are at. Enter these conversations with respect and be very open, as well as to work and seek out continuing education. There are so many ways to enrich our knowledge, and that is such a thing that I think goes for granted, you know, that we take for granted when we're so caught up with everything else in our lives. And so when we can take a moment to read different books, different memoirs, attend different conferences, different calls like this, we're expanding our knowledge on these topics. And that is definitely something a lot of the older populations and other generations can do, along with youth as well.
Yeah, I mean, someone mentioned Nessa mentions in the chat that, you know, we've worked with these children, if you will, or adults, soon to be adults, who are experiencing abuse and violence, right? And the parents prohibit us from being able to have these conversations. So, you know, they're gonna double down on when we try and talk about reproductive justice. But yeah, you know, so understanding that we have to remember to meet our populations where they're at and do it with respect. Absolutely. Ayla or Arna or Jessica, what do folks need to know to do this work, to expand, if you will, our pro social health work with young people, particularly around reproductive justice?
I think
Yeah.
oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I think one thing that is simple but often doesn't get done is just centering the voices of young people. I think young people are just used to being told what to do and how they should do it and what they should be doing, how they should be feeling, that like it's difficult for them to have any sort of sense of like self or agency. So centering like their stories and what they find important and how they feel about something, because they do care about issues like reproductive justice. It's just that their narratives are never centered. So, and even if it's not reproductive justice work, any kind of violence prevention work, like just center young people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also say kind of like recognizing power relations, and recognizing just like the bureaucratic systems around us. Like, you know, this year I've been working on getting abortion pulled on campus, and I've been noticing the inherent like power relation that comes with like me and my colleague in student government talking to the men who head up the student health center and student life administration. And so kind of like recognizing that, and recognizing also that, you know, there's so much work that young people are putting in, and there's so much lived experience that young people have that can be so valuable, and to really hear out what we're saying. You know, kind of Emily talked about meet us where we're at, and that's so important. And I feel like alongside that also comes that truly listen to us. Don't take it as like, oh, these, you know, college students don't know too much, they haven't lived as long as us. But really listen to what we're saying, where we're coming from, and recognize our lived experience for what it is. But yeah.
Ayla. Thank you, Arna. Thank you.
I mean, truthfully, I feel like they all covered everything that I would say. The only other thing that I would add is just from such a young age, you can foster a safe and welcoming environment for conversation, whether it's with your own kids or if you're a teacher or an educator, anyone that has access to kids. Right off the bat, you have the opportunity to speak to young people on the same level. I think it was Emily that said, meet me where I'm at. And, you know, not using accessible language that everyone can understand, I think speaks volumes to young people, so they feel welcomed in the space and feel like that they can contribute their own stories and can contribute questions and things like that.
Nice. Thank you for that. We need to remember to, and again, many of us have been doing work in these spaces for a long time, working with young people, young adults, youth, adolescents. And it's always important to get these reminders of meeting the population where they're at, making sure that we are centering their stories and recognizing that there are power relations and dynamics involved in being able to organize with young people, and that there are systems that are at play that we can either leverage, that we could think about leveraging and working with young people and listening to them, making sure that we're fostering safe and welcoming environments for young people to speak and be heard, that includes using accessible language, and ultimately engaging with young people with respect, holding them in very high esteem, I think is important. And we're thinking about calling to action, organizing and mobilizing people. So thank you for that. I did want to point to some current actions that are happening. And Grace, I may need your assistance with this. But given recent rollbacks of that have happened either with mifepristone, the Fifth Circuit Court back to Roe, understanding that Roe is not the totality of our focus, but the overall overarching reproductive justice overall. I'm curious about what gives people hope about doing this work. How do we continue to fight on when media coverage gives us the impression that we could just be bowled or rolled over with this? It just feels like state by state things are coming apart. How much of this does it point to a need for federal floor of protection for access? I think Arna was talking about, we can't have choice without access, right? So it's clear that one of the things that we need a federal floor of protection. And individual states can do what individual states want to do, but it seems to me that it's really important that we at least have that. What else should we be focusing on, or do you want to talk about that? Anyone can go first. Jessica, do you want to go?
Just to clarify, you're asking like how we just stay motivated?
Yes.
Activist.
Yes.
Yeah, it's difficult. Like I'm an activist and I'm, someone who has a lot of hope, but I'm also like a human. So it's like seeing a lot of these really hostile legislation and hostile attitudes is really discouraging and really sad, quite honestly. But I think one thing I think about is that like, despite legislation, abortion will always be around. It will be around like long before it was around before Roe, and it was around before Dobbs, and it will be around after whatever happens with those. So just knowing that it's just something that is always going to be around and always going to be a part of our existence as peoples, and doing what I can to make that accessible, that right accessible. And then also just being in community with everyone, especially other young people, seeing like the hope that young people have, young people younger than me as well, is like a good reminder of what I'm fighting for. And also older people who are advocates and who have been through it and who have seen a lot of history. Just sharing community with people is one way I think that I just stay kind of refreshed as an activist.
Nice. Anyone else?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I feel so motivated and moved by seeing all these young people taking it upon themselves to source proper education that is being withheld from them. And it's unbelievably moving to see them educate themselves and then go back to their communities and demand their rights and demand a proper education for their communities. I feel so fortunate to, through our work with my work with Safe Bay, have this opportunity to have these educational materials to provide to young people. I think right now, one of the biggest challenges that I face in my work is, we all experience this, but a lack of funding. And that tends to be a really difficult barrier for young people because education becomes more accessible when free resources are available to them, but they're not free if the organizations building these resources have a lack of funding. Mm-hmm. But through all of those barriers and challenges, it is still so moving to see young people say, okay, we're doing this with or without funding, but ultimately it obviously needs to come. But young people don't care. They're like, we need to be educated yesterday, so step on it.
Nice. That's interesting, the funding issue. And it's I love that Arno brought up that there are power relations and particularly around systems, and funding becomes one of those power relations. And a lot of the sexual assault, domestic violence organizations and programs around the country are feel challenged in being able to expand their work in this way because of threats to their funding, right? That they may have people on their boards of directors that don't feel that it's appropriate for them to take on reproductive justice, or there are individual schools that really like, okay, you be grateful we let you in here to talk about the R word or the DV word. Now you want to come in and talk about these other things. And so there's threats to losing their funding, losing community support, creating, antagonists, if you will, in the community that now want to target and troll our programs and our organizations because we take a stand around reproductive justice and dare educate young people about this when we know who experience the highest rates of sexual violence, when we know the rates of unwanted pregnancy that might be the result of that, and who needs to have access, right? Yet those systems seek to silence and shut our organizations down. But we have people in our agencies or in our programs who want to step out and be loud and proud and fight this fight.
Well, Safely, we do have an upcoming opportunity for young people that I would love if you all could share with all the young people in your life, specifically high school age students. And we are hosting our second Summer Activist Institute this summer in June in Maine. And it's a really great opportunity for young people from all over the country to come to this intensive institute. Of course, it's fun as well, but it's a really great opportunity to come together, meet with like-minded people that are doing this work around the country, learn from experts. And it's really a how to be a successful and effective activist. And for young people, this is a really great opportunity to learn how to organize. If they're not old enough to vote yet, that actionable item becomes a little bit in the air. You're not sure what that is. And this is a really great opportunity to learn where your space can be in the activist movement when you're still too young to vote.
And in truth, there various populations in the United States have a long history of how to organize around those oppressive barriers. I won't use the word subversive, but we have a long history of knowing how to do that, and it's just a matter of finding ways around those barriers, right? And as Jessica said, certain ways to deal with this have been around for a long time, and we will continue to find ways to support and acknowledge our own personhood, right? Our humanity and our personhood. Jessica or Emily, did you want to add anything to the how our organizations can move forward in doing this work based on certain challenges, whether they're institutional, systemic challenges?
Yeah, I definitely really want to add and highlight and uplift the importance of changing our culture. And when we're, talking about, for me specifically, I'm a college student, changing campus culture, changing your school culture. That's something I have found to be kind of one of the larger challenges in my work, because it is something that's not just involving like having people pass on programming or going through the creation of different programming. It deals with the entire campus. And there are so many factors at play that influence our culture around sexual assault, as well as, the rape culture that's evident. And so what I think my call to young people, as well as anyone else tuned in, is have conversations with your friends, have conversations with your parents, with your family, with your community leaders. It can be intimidating at times, but there have been moments where I've had conversations and I've shared about I'm a survivor myself. I was assaulted in college, and I'm also struggle with endometriosis. And so in sharing that sometimes with different people, even men on my campus, I'm then met with questions of how can I ensure that I'm going about consent in the right way with a partner? What can I do to, like, how can I respond when someone makes a joke about rape? And so in my vulnerability and in the safe spaces that I create in these smaller conversations, I hope that I just leave them knowing that something that I said hit home for that person, and that they're going to take that to those that they're headed to as well.
Excellent. Okay, and just being conscious of time, I have one final question. There's some really great comments that are in the chat, so please, if there's a way that one can respond to somebody else's request, like Amanda's had a question, like, how do you deal with anti-oppression work in your organization when your organization doesn't really see how the work that they do connects to larger issues? And someone jumped in and gave a response, and so there might be somebody you can connect with in the chat. So please peruse that when you get a chance. But here's my question. How can we continue to frame advancing reproductive rights and reproductive justice? How can we continue to frame reproductive justice and sexual violence prevention as an equity issue, as an issue of equity?
I think one of the most important things to do is to highlight stories and narratives and experiences of people of color and queer people and all of the intersections that exist between those things. I think in the reproductive justice movement, more specifically, like people who, like the pro-choice movement, largely, I think visibly, it is pretty white and pretty cisgender, unfortunately. And I know some people often use the term women when talking about abortion access. And I think just trying to shift away from that and to really look at the history of abortion access and reproductive justice. And like I mentioned earlier, who are the pillars of this justice movement? It's Black queer women and queer people and other queer people of color. So I think centering those histories when we talk about abortion access and reproductive justice is really important, but also centering the narratives of the activists that are doing the work today in those conversations.
Yeah, because it's important to recognize that reproductive rights or access and reproductive health does not mean the same thing to different populations, right? Black women in the United States have a very different history around reproduction and motherhood than Indigenous Native American folks, than immigrant folks. I mean, just during COVID, we had this horrible thing with immigrant women coming from south of the U.S. border being sterilized against their will, right? This is why we're looking at reproductive justice, right? And seeing that it goes beyond choice, right? And so about our bodies and who gets to control our bodies, right? So how do we continue to frame reproductive justice and sexual violence prevention as equity issues? Jessica, Arna, or Ayla, or Emily, anything that you want to add to that in our last 5 minutes?
I do want to say, Jessica, thank you so much for bringing up the component of language. Everyone attending, there are wonderful resources online, and I believe some in the link tree that you all will receive that break down these different changes you can make with your language. I will pull from my time working with Period, the menstrual equity movement. Not every woman is a menstruator, and not every menstruator is a woman. So changing your language from saying women or female to saying menstruator can be a lot better. When we talk about sexual assault, you can use the term survivor and victim. I prefer to say survivor, but I do recognize that and even for myself, that there is a different kind of bridge between your personal healing journey and identifying as a victim and a survivor. But those are some great ways to expand the language that you use, and also primarily sticking to they, them pronouns and content you create. We read, consume, and hear so many different things already framed that way. And when we get down to specific examples within programming, for some reason, they like to frame it as, he as the perpetrator and she as the victim. So there are a lot of different ways to frame the ways that you're having these discussions to open and make them a lot more relatable and adaptable for someone to then, pin to their own experiences.
Good. And some of that language depends on what arena you're talking in, right? So victim is very much a legalese kind of term. Survivor is what we use in the activist advocate space. Patient, might be what your SART nurses are saying, and so on and so on and so on. So we want to be clear about making sure that we're using language that is going to be receptive to the population we're working with. And sometimes you just might want to be resistant and just continue to use survivor among cops and DAs if you're engaging in the criminal legal system. That's a whole nother conversation that we can have. Ayla or Arna, did you want to contribute to the question around how do we frame this as equity issues? And then Grace wants me to wrap up.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, of course, just a small point, kind of like what Jessica's already talked about is, BIPOC people and queer people have faced historically disproportionate barriers to reproductive health care, sexual violence care, or sexual health care. And so I think recognizing that and recognizing the systemic barriers that still exist is so important, because when we talk about reproductive justice, it's so connected to the racial justice movement, and it's so essential to take that equity framework when we're talking about addressing access barriers and addressing those barriers to choice and access, because all of those are so much more exacerbated for individuals who have been historically marginalized. But yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And then Ayla, anything?
I think they covered it all.
Okay, excellent. I want to thank you all for your excellent comments and sharing your experience with us and your insights, and rejuvenating those of us who've been around for a long time. I want to thank all of you who came to be part of the conversation and chimed in and shared your experiences and your comments in the chat. Definitely reach out to these panelists for resources and make those connections. It's okay to be subversive and get around those systems and institutions that seek to deny us equity. Definitely partner with your state coalitions, or you can reach out to VALOR, and we can see how we can put you in conversation with local entities that you can partner and ally with. And I just want to say I believe in our collective power, and I believe in our ability to create change and make it so that we do have bodily autonomy and personhood and respect, and we're going to bat down these efforts to do us otherwise. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Grace.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Leah. Thank you to our captioners. This was a fantastic conversation. I know we are at time, but we will be sending out the video recording as well as access to our link tree. I know it's been thrown in the chat a few times, but thank you from the bottom of my heart. And thank you to E and Sarah for assisting with all of this planning. We look forward to continuing this conversation. This is not a one-time conversation. This is part of a movement. Thanks all, and talk to you next time.
Thank you.